My name's Dave. I'm a senior solution architect with Tableau Global Services. I am a consultant. I help all sorts of customers with Tableau, from everything from Tableau Server installation to making workbooks performant and achieve value. And I do everything in between, strategy, enablement, adoption, all those things. So with that in mind, they asked me to spend a few minutes with you guys today talking a little bit about the basic things that I use with my customers to ensure success on their projects. So before I go any deeper, I'd love to know a little bit about you guys. So in particular, how many of you are Tableau Server administrators? Okay, a handful. How many of you are Tableau Server site administrators? Okay, another handful. How many of you are project owners in Tableau Server? Okay. How many of you are just Tableau desktop users who have the ability to publish the Tableau Server? Okay, now here's a different question. How many of you are responsible for ensuring the adoption of your dashboards? Come on, everybody, raise your hands. I'm teasing. Okay, so thank you. That gives me a good perspective on where you guys are focused. Just so you know, this particular presentation will not be laden with lots of demo work. There are many features that you have had the opportunity to learn about so far this week, and if you're lucky, you can sneak in a couple more before you have to leave today. So I'm not going to focus on those things because I can't do any of them justice in an hour, because I need to cover many of them and talk about some process. So we're going to focus on the things that I use to make sure that my customers are successful. All right. Before we begin with the whole idea of enablement and adoption in general, and by the way, enablement is a fancy term for putting Tableau in the hands of people and educating them on its use, right? You could also call that onboarding. It sounds so boring. If I'd said, Tableau onboarding, nobody would have come. So basically, there are a few really basic concepts I'm going to cover. I call these foundational elements. We'll talk a little bit about education and this broader idea of enablement, going a little beyond just the onboarding step. We'll talk a lot about best practice and some quick tips for how you can focus the features of Tableau Server to influence the best practice enablement of your users. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to apply all of that over time to make sure that your Tableau Server performs well. Obviously, the bit about performance may not apply to you if you are strictly a business user, but it is essential that you understand how that works, because you as a user are an advocate for the community, the Tableau community in your place of business. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, a little participatory democracy. Okay, so a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I'm a solution architect. I work with customers mainly on the East Coast and in the central region of the US. I very rarely make it out to Washington State or California. We have plenty of people in both of those locations, so sadly I don't get to go. My previous history was focused largely on consulting to higher education, and in that role I did many implementations of all sorts, from major ERP implementations like PeopleSoft to really rudimentary shadow systems. I've implemented CRMs, you name it, I've probably touched it. In the days before that, I did web design and development, and if you have any questions about visual best practice and graphic design, I can probably help you, but I have a secret. I used to design pantyhose packaging. Hi, my name is Dave. It's sad but true. My first job out of school was a graphic designer, and I designed for prints because I'm old enough that there wasn't such a thing as a web designer. It's true. And sadly, most of my friends thought that it involved looking at lots of people of the opposite sex, but sadly it did not. it involved lots and lots of Photoshop. And, you know, it's all pixels in the end. So, now that you know all sorts of embarrassing details about me, we can actually talk about the real thing. The first part of the process is onboarding. What we want to encourage is an educated user. And when they come to us, they are not that, right? We talk a lot about analytical maturity in my job. So if I'm on site with you, I will do an assessment basically that helps determine how your average business user uses and interprets visual data, right? So visual analysis, which is what Tableau does, is generally agnostic, right? So you may be exposed to visual analysis in any number of forms, right? From reading the newspaper to doing Tableau. But many of our executives in particular, our executive stakeholders being a pretty important audience, they don't have that maturity by and large unless it is their focus, right? If they work in statistics or something like that, yeah, they probably have a little bit of experience, a little bit. But it's something we have to cultivate. So to do that, we need to set a basic foundational structure. We have to build these young students from the ground up. Ultimately, Tableau is three things. And every conversation I have about adoption, enablement, performance, governance, all of those stem from these three basic factors. Tableau must be visual. Tableau must be interactive. The third one we may not really think about too much. Tableau must be iterative. If it is not these three things, then it is not good Tableau. I fully understand that getting the second two can be kind of tough, sometimes even the first. Sorry, I should have been clicking as I said that. But we'll talk around a few ways to help you enable those users to start thinking in those terms. So that's tip number one. There should be 20 of these. So basically, if we think about those three things, we get something that looks like this, right? And you've seen a lot of this week. You've been to sessions with customers, with experts in Tableau who have developed tons of great dashboards that are visual and interactive. You click on the visualization, you drill down to content, you answer questions, you wash, rinse, and repeat, right? That is not this, in case you were curious. I think most of you probably know this by now. This is the, third day of conference. But crosstabs are not particularly visual, not particularly interactive, unless you go to great lengths, and they're really not iterative at all, right? It's the thing that our users are used to seeing, and that's why we end up providing it. Okay, so there are a few other things that we want to know. Ultimately, we want to help our users define success. This seems really basic. One of my colleagues was just in a session about how to interrogate customers and talk to them about what they need. Users don't know what they need. So how do we focus them on that so that we can give them a successful dashboard if we're analysts? By the way, this is also the responsibility of administrators as well. We need to focus on business value. Ultimately, if our user can't define the value that their dashboard provides, then they are not providing value. So what happens if they're not providing value? Their dashboard goes unused. They don't get adoption. So ultimately, we want them to focus on actionable business information. So some examples of that are, how do I move beyond these operational facts to improve that previous business decision? It's not just the portion of the monitoring that we're concerned about, it's that decision that needs to be made after that. If we're not helping our users focus on that question that is actionable, then we're doing them a disservice. Okay, so ultimately we want something more than Show me the ratio of this, give me the number of that, these dollars month over month, year over year, year to date, month to date, right? We all do those dashboards, and they're a great place to start. In and of themselves, they do not provide business value. I know that's a hard thing to hear sometimes, because we feel really good about the provision of that data, because sometimes it's really hard to get our hands on. But to a stakeholder who receives output on a regular basis from someone else who does the analysis, it represents transparent value. I could go into a deep philosophical discussion about value and how it can be transparent, but ultimately, we want something that's better. We want to know how those operational facts help us determine if our staffing and resourcing is accurate, if whether or not we have set the appropriate HR goals for people in our unit, if we have been able to accurately set our targets. How do we refine them for next year, right? We all know that our users, especially our stakeholders, are doing these things, but they aren't usually explicit in stating that the visual analysis is the thing that will inform that. So we have to help them find these actionable questions. If we're doing that, and by the way, I do this a lot, these are all whiteboard sessions answering that very basic question. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but not all of them are in my handwriting, I don't think. Yep, that upper left one. That's not my handwriting, that's a business user who had never touched Tableau before in their lives. I sat down with them for a few minutes, and we helped them focus on how they were going to derive value from the dashboard. And by the way, I tend to call those, I think battery may be dying. We tend to call those tactical elements, tactical questions. So that really just means executing to a plan or taking action. Okay, so if we map those out in a very basic process, we can identify use cases. The use cases exist within our dashboards, and that's how our users use the dashboard. Why is this important? Well, I can tell you that you can improve the performance of your dashboard if you define the use case by segmenting your data, by aggregating your data, by understanding how the user will click on that aggregated data to drill down to the detailed data. That also happens to improve performance. If I don't know my use case, my choice on how to segment that data, how to guide the user is completely arbitrary, right? We want to focus that on the business question. And if I do it over and over again, I get many use cases that tend to repeat throughout my business. How many of you have worked on a dashboard that required some sort of hierarchical staff data, right? I need to know who reports to who, right? How many of you needed to know the cost of something, right? All these things repeat over and over and over again throughout our business. If you're an administrator, you want to know this so that you can reduce the number of extracts on your server, right? Because we know that extracts can be slow and they can hurt the performance of the server over time, right? So we want to be able to focus this, and how do we do that? We do that with defining a use case. Now, once we teach our young students about this, I know we jumped from like preschool to college, please forgive me. We have several things at our disposal, right? So if your budget is low, we have lots of free materials. Make sure that your users know where to find these things and can answer them. Oh, sorry. We also have lots of things that you could pay for if you're so interested, right? We have lots of e-learning suites. We can connect to many LMSs. You may already have access to a third-party LMS that has Tableau information on it. It doesn't really matter what you choose. You want to decide on something that your users need in order to learn more about Tableau before they're responsible for exposing all that lovely data to their supervisors. And again, if you have any questions about e-learning or classroom training, I'd be glad to answer those. Now, some basic ideas that I've done at many of my customers, they seem pretty straightforward, right? We've got LMSs, we've got CAPTCHAs, we've got PowerPoints. I associate these with some sort of evaluation of my skill set They may be an internal or external test, like a qualified associate exam. They may just be as simple as taking a basic dashboard and publishing it to Tableau Server, right? It doesn't get more rudimentary than that, but it's a base requirement. So what do I need to do? You can be as loose or as rigorous as you want, but I encourage you to keep it as simple as possible. The more barriers you place in front of your users, the less likely they are to analyze your data. Now, I'm not just talking about consumers in this case, I'm really talking about analysts, people who pick up Tableau Desktop. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean just professional analysts. That really could mean business users who use Tableau for ad hoc analysis, just like they do in Excel, right? We want to encourage all sorts of use. If we have a healthy base of users in the business, then they will feed better analytical outcomes. So in the end, I have many customers who are very rigorous about this and many customers who are not rigorous at all about this. I do encourage that everyone put resources in the hands of potential users so that they know what is good. Okay, so this broader process is called enablement. Notice that, I'll try this one more time. Not gonna happen. Okay, so notice that we have a spectrum here. We need to get from exploration to guided analysis. Many of us think only about the outcome, the guided analysis, because that's what our users are focused on. Our users want to monitor a situation they already understand, and so they'll ask us for a dashboard that is meant for, at best, guided analysis. That means I'm clicking and filtering to answer some basic questions within a very well-confined set of guidelines. Exploration is where the value happens in visual analysis, right? This is what you as analysts do in Tableau Desktop on your machine every day. You're playing with the data, you're making new associations. The new associations are where the value lies, right? I'm relating this back to the business value question. The value lies in associating data in new ways. If I pick up that HR set, if I pick up that cost analysis that was used by another department, and I apply it to my information, that's new value. That's not transparent value. Okay. Ultimately, we have this crazy conception that, I'm gonna jump ahead, but I don't know how that one got over there by itself. I somehow missed that in my last presentation. So the large bucket here is our general concept from an IT perspective of what a data source should be. I should have this giant repository or data warehouse that represents every possible question that I may ever ask, right? We all know that that doesn't work, right? So we end up with not just one bucket with one funnel, we end up with many buckets and many funnels, right? In this, notice that I've got my little Tableau icons here, right? These are my published data sources. They feed a set of views. Notice that I said the Tableau extracts feed the view, not the other way around, right? We want to encourage a healthy data cycle that iterates from the Tableau extract into the view and then eventually maybe even back into the data warehouse. We want to codify good data analysis, right? If an outcome is, if an outcome is good for me and I decide it has enterprise value, and I'll talk about how we establish that later, then I want to share that with the organization. And it's not just me, the organization should want to consume it because it's better. How do we raise it? We raise it in Tableau. We get traffic, we find better outcomes, and we define that data, then we roll it back in. Once we roll it back in, we can establish new insights because our dashboards have become faster, right? Our dashboards become faster because we're doing fewer calculations, right? Notice the virtuous cycle there? Okay, so that's tip number 4, iterative data analysis. Okay, now there are lots of ways that we can use the technical features of Tableau Desktop and Tableau Server to encourage this best practice use. It might be as simple as encouraging our users who are new to Tableau to use dashboard starters. I love these, by the way. If you guys haven't had a chance to play around with them and you use some of these platforms like Salesforce, check it out. It's good stuff. And I'm pretty sure that there's at least one presentation at conference that if you didn't go to, you can get a recording of and find out more about it. Now, we use some pretty common ones like Eloqua, and I mentioned Salesforce already, and it gives you a baseline of information in those platforms to visual best practice, right? These dashboards are visual and interactive. One or two of them still have more slicers than I would like, but, right, they're generally to best practice and they should be performant, even at large scale. So, great place to start. Now, best practice is also encouraging good interaction. So, how do we do this? We may focus on mobile layouts. So this is another tip here. Make sure that if you have exposure to the outside world, the world at large, that you account for mobile analysts, right? Salespeople love to use their phones for these kinds of things, and if you grant access to the outside for your Tableau server, or sometimes even if you have VPN, then you need to remember as a developer to make sure that you're accounting for that method of consumption, or else the user experience is going to be pretty bad. I must use another word there. They're going to have to be pinching and zooming off of that standard web page. It gets really difficult and painful. And it's not that hard to do, but until we have the features they talked about yesterday morning, where it does it automatically, developers still have to think about it. You still have to arrange for that size. Interaction may be something as simple as a viz in tooltip. I can relate this back to my use case that we were talking about earlier. If I understand my use case, I can use viz in tooltip to encourage my user to better filter the data when they drill along the use case, right? I don't want to do a viz in tooltip for every element on my dashboard. That would be overwhelming and confusing. I want to focus on the thing that provides the most value in my use case. And this should also, by the way, reinforce visual hierarchy, right? So if we're doing the rollover, we're doing it in the one in the upper left-hand corner, because that's probably the most important one. We're interested in geographic analysis here. Now, web edit is a great way to encourage interaction, but be careful. It can also be confusing, right? It's not really, it gets better every year. It gets so much better, but it's still not really a replacement for a full Tableau desktop license. And don't think that you can just drop web edit on your users and they will instantly be interacting with your data. The dimensional model, the flattened dimensional model that we use is a little confusing for somebody who doesn't understand what a dimension or a measure are. And if you drop them into this and you expect them to suddenly adopt, think again. You really need to educate those users on what those things mean before you thrust them into that scenario. By the way, those same free tutorials that we talked about earlier would be great for web edit users as well. Okay, now embedding is another great feature that encourages interaction. Your users don't even, despite the Chrome that you see here, don't even have to know they're touching Tableau. You can embed that visualization directly into Salesforce or any other portal for that matter, SharePoint, you name it. That encourages interaction for the user in the place where they live, right? That increases adoption. Now, we also want to remember that bit about the value. I get lots of value if I associate to a new data source when I'm doing analysis. Essentially, that's really collaboration. But it's not just limited to that. We can focus on how we handle the communication of business users in our environment, right? I have the once again with feeling because comments really weren't all that great in previous versions of Tableau. But recently they've gotten much better. And I do encourage their use, right? So we have the ability to block comments. Unless you have really cranky users, you really should enable it. It should be used as a force of good. Mostly it's used by managers to beat their employees over the head, but maybe that's for the good of the company, I don't know. But it is a lot better than it used to be, so I do encourage that as a use case. Additionally, if we're talking about adoption, we want to encourage the use of subscriptions. Those of you who are administrators actually have to enable this. So, if you enable it, and I recommend you do, then if you're not familiar with this functionality, your Tableau users can do custom subscriptions. Well, I'll get to the custom views here in a second. And they can do subscriptions to their dashboard. Now, these days we can also do alerting, which tells us if the dashboard changes, especially in a certain direction. If I drop below a certain threshold or above a certain threshold, I get a notification in the form of an email that says, hey, go check that dashboard. This is the best way to hook an executive. Executives are busy, busy people. They can't be bothered with interaction. But if you tease them with something, they'll see it and they may be curious. So just remember, though, that the thing they initially see is just a thumbnail. If you make that visualization too complex, you're not going to grab their attention. So keep that in mind. Okay, and like I said, custom views. This is another great feature. Usually I see this adopted pretty quickly by middle management. I need to determine why something is the way that I didn't know it was. Oh my gosh, what happened to that customer? Why are we lacking in this area? Didn't we just do that initiative? Right, so if I whittle down my data, right, I should be drilling down. We're talking about that use case again. I should be drilling down in my data. Once I do, I can make that a custom view, I can save it, and then I could even share it with other users. John, why didn't you talk to your customer last week, like we talked about? So, if you're on the data side and you're worried about data strategy, right? The use cases are great, but they're only great if I can see them. So, when we talk about security and permissioning, we're focused on the data more than the workbook usually. So, if I have certified my content, it will appear as a suggestion in Tableau Server if the user is connected. I'm sorry, in Tableau Desktop if the user is connected to Tableau Server. So I get that recommendation that says, hey, use me. Somebody's already done this. And it also tells me what are the most popular fields in that data set, right? This gives me a lot of context. It helps me share. It increases the visibility over that data. Now, this is how most of us talk about that permission and security scenario. Right? Especially if we come from an IT background, we've been trained over the years to deny admittance at all costs. Lock down first, open later, right? But we really don't want that. We do if we're in a regulatory field, like, you know, have to comply with healthcare regulations like HIPAA, or, you know, have to worry about SOX compliance and all that kind of fun stuff, and trading, and who knows, right? Depending on your industry, that could be pretty onerous. So how do you balance those things? Well, you want to make sure that you increase visibility in your server while still securing the data at its root. So how do we do that, right? We can deny access to Tableau Desktop, we could deny access to Web Edit, we could deny access to Tableau Server, right? If we do all these things, we deny all of those things, then how much adoption do we think we'll get? Not much, right? We want to encourage ease of adoption by making it easy to request a license to Tableau Desktop, making it easy to get access to Tableau Server within certain constraints. This doesn't mean that I get access to everything at once. It just means that I get access to a place where I can learn how to use Tableau Desktop and share it with my friends. So we can do that by very simply isolating the permissions and security. We want it to be simple. Tableau Server is meant to be simple, and if we try to make it complex, we're not going to like it much. And it probably won't like us either. So in simple systems like Tableau Server, right, it's really easy to administer. If you've administered other BI servers, really easy compared to those. We normally have to compensate for that simplicity with increased complexity of process. So do we make the processes really complex with lots and lots of hurdles? Again, same effect. We'll squelch adoption. So we think about how groups are created in Tableau. Those of you who haven't created a group, this is the group creation process. It's really easy. I decide where my users come from, I create a group associated with that, and if I sync it to AD, I never have to touch it again. Hopefully not, by the way. Don't ever volunteer to administer AD groups if you don't have to. But we can secure them, we can give them the new licensing roles, explorers, all that kind of good stuff, but in the end, What we really care about is what they access. Notice in these examples, I'm using groups. We've got groups up at the top, and they are the access unit, not users. Another tip here, don't use users, use groups. Assign them to a project level. Use that red X sparingly. Tableau is not like other platforms if you haven't already discovered this, if you set permissions. It takes the least permissive set. All things being equal, if I'm in multiple groups, the one with the red X overrides all those green checkboxes. So in the resulting permission set, I am denied. Always use the gray box, which is an implicit denial of permission. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with row level security in Tableau? A couple hands. You might also know it as user filtering, right? So basically, we can go through a really onerous process. I shouldn't say that. Somebody's going to shoot me. This really onerous process of defining very particular equations, right? We can use functions to set up calculations that say, yes, this user has access, no, this user doesn't have access, or we could just use the groups and associate them with a data type. 90% of what we really need to do in a dashboard can be isolated to a broader group and associated with a piece of data, right? So we set it once and forget it. In the end, if we do these things, we don't have the wall of razor wire. What we really have is a nice little view into a gated garden. Yeah, the gate should be closed, but forgive me. You want to see the flowers. You want to see that there's value on the other side of that fence so that you can, I think I'm too close there, so that we can ask for permission to access it. So if I'm setting up a publishing process for my data stewards, then I want them to be able to see the good things that other people are doing. Doesn't mean you have access to it. You just see the data source, you know what it is. Can you do that if you're in separate sites? Nope. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, so I can relate all of these examples back to performance as well. If I've focused on a use case, I gave you the spoiler of this earlier, then I can segment my data, right? I can guide my users through a process. Whoa, I don't know what I just did. I think I just turned it off. Oh, there we go. Sorry, wrong button. Most of us want this Ferrari, right? We want a very fast Tableau Server. The number one reason Tableau Server is not performant is not Tableau Server. It's the dashboards on Tableau Server. Those dashboards are the car for our metaphorical road of a Tableau Server. And everybody thinks that they have a Ferrari, but what they really have is a 1984 Honda Accord. I know that this is a prelude, sorry. I couldn't find a Honda Accord. The story I love to tell is my college girlfriend had a 1984 Honda Accord. It had a maximum speed of 55 miles an hour, period. If I'm traveling on the back roads of North Carolina, then that's fine, as long as I want to obey the speed limit. Even if I have that Lamborghini, or Ferrari, sorry, then I'm not going to go faster than 55 without getting a ticket. But if we put them both on the Autobahn, one will go 200 miles an hour. One will still be going 55. And if I put lots of 55 mile an hour cars on the Autobahn, then we get a big traffic jam for all the ones that are going 200 miles an hour. So we all want this, but we don't necessarily get it unless our users understand best practice and make performance dashboards. We as administrators need to be able to identify them, isolate them, and encourage best practice. What is best practice? Avoiding the kitchen sink dashboard, right? I love to call this the kitchen sink. It's the thing that answers every question it wants, because that's possible, right? If we try to answer every question in one place, we end up with lots of crosstabs, lots of quick filters. Those things are not performant at scale. So if we focus on that visual best practice we talked about earlier, then we'll get good results. How do we know if we're getting good results? We use a performance recording. How many of you have done a performance recording before? Right? If there's one thing that I can encourage you to do after you leave here, it's to do a performance recording, even if you're an administrator. You should understand how a dashboard works and how it impacts performance. So, you'll get a copy of this slide deck, and I want you to take that URL string and append it to a URL on your dashboard, to a dashboard URL. If it works, great. You get to look at what we're looking at here. If not, you need to enable performance recording in your server or request that someone do that, and everybody should have that available. It has no negative impact and enables your users to understand what happens on the server, right? You want users, publishers, to understand the impact of their visualization on Tableau Server. This is the #1 way to do it. Now, Tableau Server works via caching, right? The value that's provided is the ability to load that visualization into memory and serve it up really quickly. That's why Tableau Server is usually, under good conditions, faster than Tableau Desktop. It's because it's already loaded, it's already there. But we don't necessarily just want to know that. We want to know exactly what it is the very first time somebody loads it. So we want to insert the bit at the end. So the first part is how I start the performance recording, record_performance equals yes. And I think we need a colon after the ampersand, I apologize. And we want to add the bit on the end. The first part of that will be in online help docs. The second part will not. We want to force Tableau Server to do a full refresh. If I have navigated to a page, it's already in cache, and if I perform the recording on the thing that's already cached, then I'm not getting the full picture. So we want to encourage both administrators and users to use the refresh equal Y. We want the worst case scenario. We want to understand what happens the first time that really non-performant dashboard loads. And then we want to make very clear what it is that's impacting that. Usually it's those green bars. Green means queries. So more than likely in most of my non-performant dashboards, I've got long query times. This doesn't mean that I'm doing a live connection. This means extracts as well, and usually is an indication that I have complex non-performant calculations or complex nested calculations that have to be recalculated after an action. How do I expose them? I roll over those little bars and they tell me exactly what they've been queried in a pane down below. You can take these as workbooks, save them, and keep them. I encourage, as a process of onboarding, I encourage my users to require that before I get access to share content with users, that I do a performance recording and publish it somewhere so that I can prove that I've done it. Now, what does this mean if we're an administrator? We take that performance recording and we relate it directly back to stats for load times, right? This is one of the delivered administrative dashboards that tells us, in the eyes of Tableau Server, exactly how long it took that visualization to load. So if we mate the two things, we'll see that there are a number of multi-threaded processes. But what we really care about is the total load time, and we can relate the two things. If we had more time, I could tell you how to get to the bootstrap information that is particularly relevant when you're working with dashboards and a performance recording against an extract. But we don't have a lot of time for that, unfortunately. So this is the next best way, this is the best way, actually, of pulling the total load time. Now, the thing that I didn't mention is, if we have a performant dashboard, a non-performant dashboard, we'll get the stuff up there, sorry, way up there in the red to the right. We'll get maybe 20, 30 second load times, maybe longer. If we tune the performance of that dashboard, we may get it down to, say, 4 seconds. If it's performant and it's cached, we can get down very, very low. I've seen 60-second dashboards get down to sub 2-second load times. You just have to be careful. You have to focus on the use case, and you refine your data to make sure that the users are focused on the best practice and the business value. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I skipped a point there. We can also do things like validate these load times, these general load times, using tools like TabJolt or Scout or what's the new one, Replay. I just saw something about that today. And that will help us set a bench line for performance in the server so that we can observe how the server performs under load. That helps us understand the impact. Tableau doesn't break, it slows to a crawl. So when you see Tableau Server approaching capacity, it's just going to get slower and slower and slower. It won't break. You won't get catastrophic failure unless something really bad is wrong, right? Normally, you're at maybe 80% process capacity if you're watching such things with a tool like Tabmon on your server, and you'll be getting double, triple load times, right? That's just how it appears. How do you know that? How do you know that's good or bad? You have to observe it. Use tools like Tabmon and Tabjolt to help you set that baseline. Okay. Now, if we take all these concepts, the basic stuff, the foundational, the best practice, and we want to push them out to users, what does that mean? Ultimately, it means governance, right? We all probably start from some idea of self-service. Tableau's really good at that, but we want to encourage best practice. How do we do it? Well, we have to have some guardrails on that server. It could be big G governance, or it could be little g governance, right? We're talking City Hall, not Capitol Hill, right? We want to encourage our community to enforce best practice themselves. How many of you have screamed against the wind against a user who has published a dashboard that was non-performant? Well, I know I have. Do it all the time. And sometimes we just don't have the ability to influence that user. Maybe they're highly placed. Maybe they just don't care, right? Do we boot them off the server? Well, that's kind of counterproductive for adoption. So what do? We empower community members to enforce that best practice, right? We set up things like user groups that educate our users on that best practice. We set up a center of excellence that focuses on encouraging and/or enforcing best practice throughout the community. And we start looking in that process for good executive stakeholders, right? What's good for project management is good for Tableau Server as well. The more highly placed the members of our COE, the better our outcomes will be. Over time, that should grow. You may not get your CIO on that board at first, or ever, but you will probably have the ability to grow the leadership positions in the COE. Sorry, by the way, COE means Center of Excellence, but it has many names. Center of Excellence, Center of Expertise, Center of, whatever. COPs I've heard as well. They all pretty much are the same thing. Ultimately, what I encourage is a hybrid or decentralized governance model. I want to encourage the community members to enforce best practice while also allowing basic growth and encouraging adoption with as few guardrails as possible. Now, this doesn't mean that my highly utilized enterprise content that's shared with lots of business units is all willy-nilly, right? That stuff can still go through a centralized process whereby I am doing change management. I'm controlling the publishing of that process and someone is certifying it. But when my user first comes to Tableau Server, they're in a free space, they're in a departmental space. They have the ability to publish to a dev folder, and they can request access for self-publishing cycles. So what does that look like? Oh, sorry. And the reason we do this is because it doesn't matter what we do. Users will find a way to share their information if it's good. So we want that to be on our platform, not through some weird exception, right? Nothing looks worse than a user going around the process with that dashboard that saved $50 million today, right? Okay, so we want to keep this simple again. We want to focus on very few groups, right? I want groups that are so simple anybody can understand them. I also want that because I want to enable the business users to manage them and be responsible for them, not me as an administrator. How many of you spend a lot of your day moving permissions around, moving groups around, adding and subtracting users in a manual process? It's no fun, right? Administration should be simple and easy, not complicated and time-consuming. So you can ignore the admin ones. We have to include those. What we really want to focus on are three major groups: developers, approvers, and consumers. I like to say consumer because this enforces or reinforces the idea of that interactor user who is going for guided analysis, right? They're not doing the exploration. They're not really coming up with the aha moment. That happens for the developer or analyst who's using Tableau Desktop and making the first associations. So what does that look like in a published scenario? I encourage, and I already spoiled this already, but I encourage the use of very few sites in my Tableau Server environment. In this case, I have a certified site and a department site, 2 sites, period, nothing else. I do everything else in projects, and I use naming convention to help me with that. If you have nesting, you can do some of that as well. I've left that out of here because at this time, if you're nesting projects, the assignment of permissions is still at the parent, right? So you can subdivide content underneath that general use case, but you can't secure it in another way. So we're still talking about a parent structure that is one use case. So we can think about the things over here on the right as maybe being sub-projects. But in the end, we're representing one use case path with one set of groups. Each set of groups reflects the use case. So when I allocate space to a user, they send a request. The request says, I have this business value that I need space for. And that's about all it says. It may also say where my data came from, but that's just gravy. Then they get a departmental space. And that departmental space will be for the developers or analysts. The analysts will then, in turn, forward the request for the use case to probably the Tableau Server administrator. That's usually how it works, to validate that the basics have been met. And then the Tableau Server administrator forwards the request on to the AD team, for most of my customers, to create the group. And the group is managed by the users. They sign on the dotted line as a data steward. And I'm very explicit when I call it a data steward. That's that big G governance term that sometimes has weight to it. And we want to encourage that best practice, and that good behavior. That's a good way to do it. If I'm in a healthcare environment, they're the HIPAA signatory, right? They're the person who's supposed to be enforcing allowable access to the data. Now, once I split that out, I can have a number of paths all on use case. And I want those to change. I want those to develop over time. I want those to iterate. So in the end, we end up with one path for use case, dev, test, and the prod, which is use case. By the way, you don't ever need to put prod in the title. Okay. Now, in the end, we really care about that data. And that's what we really care about governing. So we want to make sure that the good data gets the kudos. We want that little ribbon symbol to appear next to our data. And we do that in a very, very simple way. We go to details as an administrator and we say this data is certified. It's that simple. That means that when I'm looking at data sources in Tableau Server, that data source floats to the top. If I'm a data steward who has access to see all certified data sources, which is what I recommend, right? You should have access to see all those data sources if you're a data steward. That doesn't mean that you can access them. It just means that you see them in the folder hierarchy. They have a description. The description tells me what they're used for, and I can say, oh, wow, man, that's a really good data source, I think. I'd really like to see that. Maybe I should put in a request for access, right? We want to increase that visibility. Think garden, not barbed wire. Okay, and if we make it that way, we can then raise that to the users. I'm sorry, it's a light bulb, not a ribbon. I don't know why it's not. Maybe it is a ribbon. It's just hard to see at the small detail level. And it floats to the top, right? When I'm doing that search, the certified content always floats to the top. So you want to encourage that. It's so easy to do. I encourage you to use it. Now, once we, excuse me. Once we do all of those things, we need to monitor good behavior, right? We don't want our users 3 months later to go off the reservation and start doing crazy stuff, right? Users are notorious for that. They start off, they agree, they do things, they get in a hurry, the boss says tomorrow, and they stop following best practice. So what do? Well, there are lots of delivered administrative dashboards to determine whether or not our servers perform it, right? We can say, oh, that particular dashboard got slower over time, and the users will have to prove that it hasn't with a performance recording, but it doesn't really tell us things like true adoption. We can see view rates, possibly, but it's not real easy. So what do? we come up with some custom administrative dashboards. These happen to be screenshots from Mark Jackson. Anybody heard of Mark Jackson? He's a Zen master. This is a really old set of dashboards. It's from like version 7 or, no, I'm sorry, 8.2. And they're a little wonky if you start digging in the custom SQL, but they still work. That's the beauty of them. So they're really easy to understand. And it's not in this set, but there's also one that tells my publishers, it's user filtered, tells my publishers how their content is doing, right? I'm enabling a dashboard in Tableau to give them feedback on their adoption rates, right? So if you haven't tried this and you're an administrator, I encourage you to do it. You do need the read-only user access to the PostgreSQL repository in order to get that. But if you have that, you're golden. You can get all sorts of great visualizations, and there's way more than this. The current generation of dashboards were developed by a product team in Tableau that used to be headed by Michael Chen. Michael Chen published a blog post way back when version 9 was released, and I also use that as well. Again, it's not brand new, it doesn't really matter. It's good stuff. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about onboarding. We talked a little bit about best practice. We've talked a little bit about scalability. Hopefully those things are starting to show some relationships now, right? We didn't go digging into exactly where to click because frankly, most of the stuff we talked about, you can find yourself. And I encourage you to do those things, right? I really do encourage you to go to the performance recordings, to certify your content, to isolate your groups to projects. Your permissions to groups and your groups to projects, right? You can do all of those things. They're not really difficult things. Again, Tableau Server is meant to be simple. So, yay! But Dave, you said there were going to be 20. There was only 19. So before you hit the road, there is one more thing that we have to remember. We have to encourage both users and administrators. We have to encourage each other to remember that there is no easy solution to process, right? We all have to get our hands dirty and do a little work. So, especially for users, this is a hard concept to understand. In a self-service environment, it's somebody else's problem if things are slow. Well, that's not really the case with Tableau. So, remember, users have to get their hands a little dirty. And then you'll have that very fancy, speedy Ferrari that you've always wanted. Okay. All right, so we've got, actually, I have no idea how much time we have. We have a couple minutes. Awesome. Anybody have any questions? I've worked with many, many customers. Feel free to pick my brain. Yes?
Could you give us a little more detail about filters?
I'm sorry?
Permission, the permission part where you mentioned red.
Oh, yes. Sorry. By the way, don't forget to do an evaluation. Hopefully you thought it was useful. And I will go back, way back. Back. It's hard to explain unless you're looking at the permissions. Sorry, come on. Did I pass it? Go. Maybe I already passed it. Did I pass it? Okay, top up here. Really, I just wanted to see the old Honda again. Is this it? Darn. So basically, there's a decision tree that Tableau follows when you're looking at permissions. And essentially what it does is it looks for user allowance first. And again, the reason I don't recommend that is because it's really hard to administer users, right? Right now you may only have 20 projects or 20 business units, tops. And it may, in a small company, that may not be very onerous. But if you start growing at all, and the point of this is increasing adoption, then it's going to be really hard to use those user permission settings. Man, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time finding this. And when we look at the way the permissions are allocated, it evaluates user permissions first. And then after the user permissions, it evaluates our group permissions. Man. And so when it evaluates those permissions, that's row level. There we go. Sorry that took so long. Okay, so what it does is it goes through a decision tree. The decision tree is, am I granted access? I'm sorry, am I denied access? Am I granted access? It checks users first, and then it checks groups. There is a decision tree in the online help doc if you want to see a visual aid for this about how the decision tree works, but evaluates users first. So you have a user row in permissions, and you have a red X, then you're denied regardless of whatever group you're in, right? So you can override with an individual, but I don't recommend using individuals. I always recommend using groups because they're much easier to administer. So if I'm in multiple groups, we omit the user part. If we're in multiple groups and we set that red X, that means, because I'm evaluating the negative first, am I denied? Not am I allowed. Am I denied? Because of that, if I have a red X in any group that I'm in, I am denied, period. This is a little counterintuitive. Lots of other systems are allowed if I have any green check mark, but we evaluate the deny first. So it's hard to remember. Yeah.
Actually, I was talking about the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
The rollable security? Is that what you meant?
yeah, I was more interested in how, in my situation, I might need to filter based on the data
Mm-hmm.
that they can.
Yeah, I mean, you can still do the calculations to do row filtering that way, right? And
Assign that to a certain group. Is that
you can, and you can use the group as a calculation as well if you need a complex evaluation. Normally, though, like I said, 80 to 90% of scenarios can be resolved by assigning a group to a particular unit in the data. And by the way, row level filtering in Tableau has to be an association between user and a data point. So you have to have that association. Yeah, can't just be arbitrary.
and it can be assigned to groups.
Yes.
User groups.
Yep. And so what I'm recommending here is that you assign the group through the basic functionality. So when you start a user filter in Tableau Desktop, you get a pop-up, and the pop-up says, choose your user and choose the data element that you're looking for. In this case, we're using region. So I could click on every individual user, right? Or I could just select the users that are already in the group labeled East, right? So that's what I'm saying, is you should have an AD group that represents a particular use case, and the use case would be regional analysis, and that group would be East. And then you check the box for East, and then you forget about it because somebody else maintains that AD group. Yeah, so that's a lot simpler than doing the calculation where I'm doing a username or group evaluation in Tableau as a calculation, because you have to maintain that as a developer, right? If you go through and you do lots of changing, it still represents work either way, right? If your groups change significantly over time, you still have to do some maintenance, but you don't have to do user maintenance. Hopefully that makes sense. Anybody else have any questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much. Hope you guys got some useful information on that. And don't forget about the survey.